The pandemic is already history, and thank God for that. Never been to Denmark, never been on an oil rig, never met a person with a name as fascinating as Tabish. Well, we have it all here for you in this session. The Body by the Shore, Tabish Khair with Preeti Gill.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Red Couch where I am now with Tabish Khair. Somebody just said, I think when they announced that it's a name they haven't heard before. And this is his novel that we're going to talk about today, The Body by the Shore. I will ask him just 3 or 4 questions and then I'm going to request each one of you to go out and buy it because it's really a thrilling read. Whether it's a sort of speculative fiction, whether it's a thriller, whether it's got a lot of science in it. Maybe we begin with that. So tell us what this book is meant to be, Tabish, and also maybe because I found it really atmospheric, the reading of it, and it is in an oil rig. There are scientific experiments going on, so it's something which is quite different from what you might find. And so I would also like Tabish to do a little bit of reading to just show us that.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll take it back. Thank you, Preeti, for this very positive recommendation. Those of you who have read my previous novels would know that I like to change my setting and my style. I would claim, and I take a degree of pride in that claim, that I've never written the same novel twice. And I think it's actually a bit of a pity that in the literary world one does not notice things like that. For instance, if it comes to acting, we would praise, say, Meryl Streep or Shabana Azmi because they have done different roles. But in the literary world, we end up praising writers who very often end up writing the same novel 10 times. So in that sense, I would claim that I have written a different novel every time. And this time I moved into what people would term a speculative fiction, science fiction, something like that. There are always various reasons for writing a book, especially a novel. People say that there's never one ending, but of course there's also never one beginning. And in this case, there were several beginnings, and I'll just point out some of the obvious ones that I still remember. One of them was, that's an element that got played down as the novel progressed, because that's, again, something that happens. You start writing a novel, and your core idea is stay more or less the same, but then the novelist starts speaking to you. That's when you know that the novel is going to get done, when it starts speaking to you. And sometimes you speak back, and you ask the novel to shut up. But sometimes the novel asks you to shut up and you listen to the novel. So obviously it changes as it progresses. Now, what I started with was this element that has always fascinated me, this dichotomy, supposed dichotomy between reason and emotion. Okay? So it started with that. If you read the novel, you realize that element sort of underlines some of the happenings. The other thing that kind of overlaid that development was, first of all, my fascination with science and with philosophy. Now, it's not a heavy novel, don't worry. I mean, and that's part of the reason. If I write it as a novel, it should be a novel. It shouldn't be a book of philosophy. So, and I've always been fascinated by this overlap when it comes to theoretical physics and philosophy. For instance, and then again, that overlap is also there when it comes to, let's say, philosophical religion. Now, if you think of, for instance, just to illustrate the point in a very simple way, if you think of the notion of God. Now, from a religious perspective, I would say a truly religious perspective, and I speak as someone who essentially considers himself an atheist. But I'm an atheist who respects religions in their philosophical forms. From a religious perspective, God cannot be defined. Okay? So actually, we lack the word for God. We don't even have that word. That word is itself a human creation. Now, when it comes to quantum physics, we say quantum particles are waves and particles. So what we are saying is that we don't really have a name for this thing in language. What we are saying is something very similar to what the deeply religious say about God. Okay, and that's why when people start telling you what rituals to observe, how to worship God, and so on and so forth, I tell them that actually you're performing, you're committing some kind of blasphemy because you're defining God for other people. You can define it for yourself, but defining for other people, which you cannot do. Okay, so these were elements that went into it, and then of course the aspect of science, how science develops, how scientists actually come together and try to make something that very often gets taken over by people in power and turn into something else. So these were all the elements that went into it.
Do you want to read a little bit, like just maybe a couple of minutes?
Sure. It's difficult to read from a novel like this because there are actually three streams there. One of them, the central protagonist there is Jens Erik, who is he's a retired police officer. He's taken early retirement. He's going to retire in a year, and he has lots of hours piled up, so he's taken early retirement. And he's definitely prejudiced against immigrants. His daughter considers him to be a racist. He refuses to accept that definition, but he's definitely prejudiced. And then there's another strand that centers around someone called Haris Malouf, who is a kind of mercenary, official mercenary, who is now living a retired life. And then there's a girl from the Caribbean, Michelle. All of them finally end up on an oil rig in the North Sea, which is where much of the mystery is actually taking place. Bear in mind that there are oil rigs all over the world, abundant by the big corporations who have extracted the oil, but they have not put in money to remove the oil rigs, because that will cost a lot of money, because there are chemicals and other things in the oil rigs, and it's not that simple to take them out. So this is a big issue that no one talks about. And of course, now it all starts with a kind of challenge that Jens Erik's daughter issues, where she says to him, "Are you sure, Far is Papa in Danish, are you sure, Far, that you've never discriminated in the crimes you have been asked to solve on the basis of color or race or anything like that?" And Jens Erik, of course, rejects that suggestion, but then he thinks about this body of a young black man that was washed up by the shore, not on the shore, by the shore of Aarhus. And this was a man who was intact, but he had some of his organs removed.
Let's not give away the whole.
Yeah, exactly. So that is. I mean, I'll only say this much. So it starts with that organ trafficking thing, but then of course it moves into something completely different. So I'll read out an extract where Jens Erik is talking to one of his informers, a Bengali sausage kiosk man, who used to sell sausages made of pork, and has finally quit that profession, and has now opened a small electronic shop in something called Bazaar West in Aarhus, which is a fascinating area, large factory now turned into a collection of about 100 shops, all of them run by immigrants from outside Europe. So you enter Bazaar West and suddenly you are in Asia or Africa, while the rest of Aarhus is obviously very Scandinavian. So this conversation takes place there. I mean, the narrative is telling you a bit about Bazaar West, so I'll start with that and then move on. The initiative had grown. More shops had been added. It now is stretched over 11,000 square meters, mostly full of people who, at first glance at least, did not seem Danish. Turkish and Indian restaurants, vegetable sellers, greengrocers, bakeries, meat shops, grills, carpet and rug merchants, shops offering anything you can think of, though mostly on the cheaper side, cafe and kiosk galore. It was the rest of the world, conveniently packaged away under a rooftop in one corner of Aarhus. Outside you had cars playing loud music. Inside there were old men hanging around and talking almost in whispers to one another, women in all kinds of attire. If you listened, you heard other languages, though mostly Danish is what dominated, for there were quite a few Danes around, feeling like tourists in Bazaar West, and in any case the only language in common between most of these people from different nations and their children who had grown up in Denmark was Danish. Jens Erik had never been able to make up his mind about this place. But that is where he sits, in a Turkish cafe, drinking Turkish coffee, a few feet away from a glass cabinet displaying the sort of sweets Jens Erik would never eat. But the coffee is not bad. He concedes that much to the Pernilla voice in his head. Pernilla is his daughter. He concedes that much to the Pernilla voice in his head. Of course, he has been here before, but only in uniform, and hence he had never tried their coffee. Jens Erik is strict about such matters. Hanif doesn't have a coffee in front of him. He has a very impressive phone, the flashiest and flattest Jens Erik has seen for years. He has a large glass of cola. He also has a succulent shawarma sandwich in a plate and has taken such a big bite of it that it is a minute before he can speak. Then he answers Jens Erik's questions. It has never been a secret, he finally says. Jens Erik looks away. Hanif drinks from his glass and continues. It has never been a goddamn secret except for you guys. Half the people here must have heard of it. He waves his arms around, indicating the two young men with tonsured heads, in keeping with the fashion, behind the counter, the Somali or Yemeni family at a table farther back, the stream of men and women, one in a chadar, two in shorts, walking past in the corridors outside. What has not been a secret? Jens Erik asks. Hanif dramatically lowers his voice. Why lower your voice? Jens Erik wonders if it is not a secret, but he does not say anything. These people just love drama and conspiracies. No wonder their countries are full of both. You read the goddamn papers, Jens Erik. Hanif whispers. You know they talk of refugee smuggling routes, whatnot. Yes? Well, this is one of them, my friend. In the North Sea? In the North Sea? What do? Put refugees in deep freeze and ferry them across? Jens Erik is entirely skeptical. Hanif lets out a guffaw. Yes, he says. Yes, that is what they actually do, or did. Only not all of the goddamn refugees, choice pieces of them. He points to another counter with kebab on his skewers, slices of meat, samosas, falafel. Choice pieces, you know, like kidney, skin, eyes, heart. You're talking organ trade? You have no idea, Jens Erik. Hanif sounds excited, despite himself. You have no idea. This thing was big before 2020. It had been going on for years, but we started hearing about it around then. I remember being told of it a few months before the virus hit us. That is why I remember when I heard of it. Then I started paying attention. We heard of men and women, young ones, always healthy ones, disappearing. Jens Erik starts to interrupt, but is waved into silence by Hanif, who continues. These youngsters were always promised another life, another identity. They disappeared. And there was nothing one could prove. All had contracted with just one tourist agency, that is what they called themselves. They were getting across illegally anyway. And often, their relatives assumed they had just gone underground. It happens. People are smuggled in somewhere, you do not hear from them for a year, 2 years, 10 years. And then they contact you once they have the papers. But in these cases, there were weirder rumors. There was a travel agency in Dhaka with a branch in Nairobi, maybe elsewhere too. It was called Magic Gates. And it insisted on men and women going through medical tests. They even paid for it. The agency, not the tourist, paid for it, mind you. And all the men and women who claimed that they had been given perfect health certificates simply disappeared. Whatever route, whether they were smuggled by sea or land, whether it was via Russia or Greece or directly to the US, whatever the modus operandi, not one of these illegal immigrants was ever seen or heard from again. What happened to the agency? What was it called? Magic Gates, everyone knows. They closed in 2021 or 2022, soon after the pandemic. Some people had tipped off the police in Germany or Sweden or Nigeria, and it was said the police had tipped off the agency people. But then a bit later, there were rumors that the people behind this agency were still around and involved in something bigger. Something bigger? Hanif toys with his phone. He seems to think. Then he looks Jens Erik in the eyes and says, something official, bigger. Why bigger? Hanif stares at Jens Erik. Then he answers seriously, because it is quieter. Then he returns to his jovial manner and waves his short arms around once more. You won't call this place quiet, will you, my friend? He asks. Jens Erik, who has been struggling to hear Hanif over the terrible cacophony of people talking, shouting, listening to music so un-Danish, shakes his head. Well, Hanif continues chuckling, if you go to these new malls in town, they will be quiet, much quieter. Last time I was in one of them, I fell asleep on a bench. It was that quiet. Why, my friend? Why are they so quiet? Because that is where the real money is, not here.
Thank you. So, as we can already see from his reading, you've actually pointed to many of the themes that form the backbone of the book. Migrants, for example, which dominate all the newspapers. So whether it was during COVID, because this book is in 2030 in Denmark, post-COVID. And there's a lot of what happens in this post-COVID world. So one is the fact of it being that time period, because you've already passed, crossed the virus that none of us expected, and that was like really this powerful thing that took over your mind and body. And now, once again, so there is the migrants, there is this illegal trade in organs, and there is also this collusion between the industry, the higher powers, so that's where all the money is. So these are the themes that you are doing, that are being explored in this book. So tell me what, so we were talking about this earlier, the way you use fiction to tell these stories.
Well, this is part of my larger agenda, and I have been actually making this point also as a critic. I have been arguing for a number of years now that one of the biggest problems, I would say the biggest problem in the world, at least from my perspective, if we put aside problems like, say, poverty or overpopulation and things like that, and obviously environmental degradation, which is the result of all these problems. But at the intellectual level, if you ask me to point to one problem in the world today, I would say it is the fact that we no longer read literature. At least we don't read literature as literature. And why am I saying so? I'm not saying so just because literature teaches you empathy and so on and so forth. Those points have been made and they're valid points. What I'm saying so because literature is the oldest thinking device known to humankind. Okay? We think through literature in different forms. And if we don't read literature as literature, we fail to think in certain ways. Which is why, while we need to read literature also politically, sociologically, and so on and so forth, we need to come back and read it as literature. And what literature does, and why literature is such a important thinking device, and I mean, it's an important thinking device. No religion would survive without literature. All religions are based in literature. They claim that their literature is the best. And then, of course, their fundamentalists jump in and ask you not to read it as literature. I tell you, no, it can only be read in this way, this one particular way, no other way, which basically means they're telling you don't read it as literature. So they draw on the power of literature, and then they ask you not to read it as literature, which means they ask you not to think. But in their original forms, literature, religions have been thinking devices. They have used literature to make us think. Whether I can go on talking about this for hours. This is one of my pet topics. So when I write, I do think of literature as a thinking device, which doesn't mean that I'm going to write, at least as far as I'm concerned, I do think I don't write boring books. I mean, I have this reputation of being a literary writer, but I love genres. I always play with genres. Every one of my novels has some take on some genre or the other. It might be some kind of slightly ribald humor in how to fight Islamist terror from the missionary position. It might be some kind of a war thriller in Jihadi Jain. It might be some kind of a neo-Victorian mystery in The Thing About Tax. But I always play with genre because I do want to grab the reader's attention. And more than that, I feel that genres also help you think. The things you can do. The general point that some of my literary writer friends make, which they say, oh, we don't do plots. I'm a literary writer, I don't do plots, which is fine. Sometimes some novels need to be written without plots too because you have a reason to do that. But just this dismissal of the plot seems to be problematic to me because the plot is also a literary device. It's like writing a novel without using the alphabet B. Now, you can do it for a certain purpose, you can do it for fun, but to do it again and again seems to be to limit yourself. So I have that vision of literature. And I feel that the ability to read literature as literature makes us think. And one of the main reasons it makes us think is that literature, unlike all other disciplines, and I would say all other disciplines, literature, when it is written and read as literature, does not just depend on language, because obviously language is the only thing it depends on, but it also depends on the silences, contradictions, and other things between language, which is why it can relate to reality in a very complex way. It doesn't just tell us this is what it was. It also tells us certain things without telling us anything, which is why we can go back today and read, say, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and consider it a racist book, like Achebe did, and still find things that are so complex, so critical of colonization, that you are astounded. And that's what literature does. So when I write, I try to do that in my novels. I try to think through my novels, assuming that I'll meet readers who will also like to meet me halfway. I believe that I'm walking towards you and you're walking towards me, and we meet somewhere in the middle. And in that halfway space, you will make me think. Maybe by your response, I'll make you think, and between us, we will all be able to think. So that is exactly what I set out to do.
So this novel, of course, is set in Denmark, like I just said, and like you've been saying, talking about it, with characters who are all Danish or largely Danish. But India does enter the novel in many, many ways, not only with the 2 or 3 scientists who are there, then there is the journalist who is very close to who we know. And then there are certain things that are happening in contemporary times which are sort of alluded to. Do you want to talk about how you bring India in?
Sure. Well, I mean, this novel is largely set around Denmark, but it also goes to other spaces. There are some excerpts in the US, there's some excerpts in England, there are some excerpts in Japan, there are some excerpts in India. Actually, even after I had published this novel, it came out in America about 3-4 months back, and came out in India just about a month back. And until then, I had not noticed what had happened. And then someone who had read it said, "Oh, but all your other novels have been mostly based in one country or at the most 2 countries." But this novel seems to be taking place, even though it's mostly around the North Sea and Denmark, much of it takes place in so many other countries. And I hadn't actually thought of it. I said, how did this happen? And I thought about it, and I realized that the only explanation is that I wrote this novel during the pandemic. I was shut up in a room. I could only go for walks in my neighborhood. And maybe one part of me was just simply resisting that confinement. So in my novel, without realizing it, I ended up going to so many different places. And that's also something that the novel does, the novel form does. It enables you to enter other spaces and other minds and so on and so forth, without making the claim that you have the only understanding of that space or that mind. So in that sense, it also enters India. There's a scientist, because one stream of the novel is centered around an obscure little seminar on the mind and the body that takes place in Aarhus sometime, I forget, but it's like 2014 or something like that. And then and this is a very obscure seminar, even though there are 4 or 5 people there, at least 4 or 5 people, and all the other have good reputation, but 4 or 5 people who were actually very big in their fields. They're all from different fields. Once upon a time, they were very big, but by 2014 or so, their careers had been going down, all of them. And these people meet in Aarhus, and they have a seminar, and then soon after that, 4 or 5 years after that, they start disappearing. They die in mysterious circumstances, or they disappear. So that's the other extreme. And one of the scientists is actually an Indian who has mostly grown up in England and America and worked there, but some time before the pandemic, he returns to India. And here, in due course, he becomes some kind of a radical figure in the tribal belts. Okay, and then he disappears. Okay, so that is the Indian connection, and that also brings in a journalist who is a feminist journalist, and our main account of that scientist is through her, but she herself is shot in her office by people who were never arrested sometime in 2024 25.
And all those little comments which come in, no, about school uniforms becoming orange and so on. So there's a lot in this novel. I mean, it's a thriller with a really thrilling finish. Could be a film, James Bond or whoever, but it's really exciting.
And Preeti, if I may say so, because I just attended your session with Jerry, and Jerry, of course, I'll interrupt you too, but of course, there's no way I'm going to compete with Jerry. Jerry Pinto or Javed Akhtar, with whom I've done a couple of sessions. These are people whom I actually put down in my diary and say, never do a session with them, because they're such fascinating speakers that they really won't have a chance to say anything. I did a session with Javed Akhtar, there were 4 of us, and Javed Akhtar got going, and basically we just sat there and listened to him. We didn't want to say anything. What's the point? So I'll interrupt you in this case. And I would like to say that there's a lot of scientific facts and figures in this novel. Every one of those facts and figures is actual. Okay, so some of the characters, the scientists obviously are not actual, but the facts and figures are absolutely actual. The number of microorganisms in the human body and so on and so forth, all of them are there.
So just go out and buy it.
Okay. Thank you for coming to this session, and have a good time. Yeah.